First place. There you go. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for the Comptroller's Work Group on pandemic spending. This is the next to last meeting. Today, this work group continues its mission to fulfill its legislative mandate of oversight and accounting for the billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that have been expended over the last 2 years. I believe it's both morally and fiscally prudent that we continue to evaluate these transactions to guard against waste, fraud, and what we call pandemic profiteering. I'm very excited for today's meeting as we will hear from industries that were especially, unfortunately, impacted by the pandemic, and that is our restaurant, lodging, and craft beverage sectors. And we'll get some valuable insights on the effectiveness of the actions taken by the federal government and local government to keep the lights on for those businesses and the hundreds of thousands of Marylanders that they employ. While the worst is behind us, businesses continue to feel the economic ripple effects from the pandemic. Now, increased costs for goods and services, supply chain issues, and a historic inflation and triggered in part by the unprecedented federal spending in response to the pandemic. I welcome today's stakeholders from the restaurant, lodging, and alcohol industries and look forward to hearing their experiences over the past 2 years and get a sense of how and where the millions of dollars in federal, state, and local money were appropriated to those industries, how it was spent. Just like every work group meeting, this meeting is open to the public, both by live stream and in person, so that Marylanders can personally witness how their money has been spent. We will first receive a presentation from Mr. Kevin Atticks, CEO and founder of Grow and Fortify, and Executive Director of the Brewers Association of Maryland, the Maryland Wineries Association, and the Maryland Distillers Guild. With Mr. Atticks is Ms. Julie Verratti, co-founder of the Denizens Brewing Company, about a mile from my house. Path is well trodden over to Denizens Brewing Company. And she was a former appointee to the Small Business Administration. Following Ms. Verratti will be Mr. Marshall Weston Jr., President and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Maryland. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Jeff Brainard, Vice President of Hospitality and Sales for Southern Management Companies, one of our most outstanding Maryland companies. Thank you all for attending. And with that, Mr. Atticks and Ms. Verratti, please begin your presentation. Thank you, Kevin. Julie, can you go up with him and just kind of...
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this group. Very much appreciate your interest in our industry. I'll talk just very briefly about, and I'll jump through 3 slides here, about Grow and Fortify and what we do. So we're a firm that was developed to support the value-added agricultural industry in the state. So that's everything, every type of company that takes an agricultural product and through some process, brewing, distillation, whatever it might be, turns it into a much more valuable agricultural product, which through the whole chain creates jobs, taxes, and employs a lot more people and keeps the farms sustainable. What we do on a day-to-day basis, we manage the Maryland Brewers Association, the Brewers Association of Maryland, the Maryland Distillers Guild, Wineries Association, and a number of other commodity organizations in an effort to, again, grow that agricultural base, grow that tourism base. And a number of years ago, we put out a report that shows the true value, and I encourage you to check this out just so you can see the incredible value that these types of businesses bring to rural Maryland, not just rural Maryland, because a lot of times their tasting rooms are in retail areas, commercial areas. So there's such an economic impact from this industry. Today, I'll talk a little bit about the broad craft beverage industry and the impacts that this pandemic brought upon it. And we've got Julie Verratti here from Denizens Brewery, 2 great locations, same great beer, who can give you the ground level. So I'll jump through my presentation and then turn it over to Julie, and feel free to jump in at any point. So we started before the pandemic with quite the economic impact. 120 licensed breweries around the state, 100 licensed wineries, distilleries. There are 40 in operation in 2021, and you see the economic impact there. Hundreds of millions of dollars that this industry brings. I'm sure you'll hear this from the other speakers as well, but during the pandemic, first I'll say that the beginning few weeks and months of the pandemic was sheer terror for a business owner trying to figure out what the next steps would be. When you don't know what those next steps are going to be, you can plan for just about everything, we say in this industry, but we couldn't really plan for this because the bottom dropped out of the industry in very different ways throughout the pandemic. First and foremost, our group had twice weekly calls. Every time the Comptroller or the governor took to a mic, we had an industry call thereafter to translate, to follow up, to go through the executive orders, and to walk the industry through what it meant. And then as the pandemic wore on, it broke into 20-some different types of phone calls as the various counties, various jurisdictions took on their own rules and regulations, and some could be open, some could not be open. There were enforcements that seemed to be contrary to what was stated in executive orders, and so there was a lot of commotion. What's important to note about our industry is that it's not just one industry. They have very, very different priorities as businesses, but the top priority is hospitality. Bringing people either to the brewery, the winery, the distillery to experience the product. That's what brings the real value to this industry. Or it's that tourism, that branding, which marches out hopefully into retail sales in restaurants and in beer, wine, and spirit stores. All of those things were turned on their heads. You had businesses closing. You had, even though our industries were deemed priority and that they were allowed to operate from a manufacturing standpoint, and they were allowed to do some things which I'll talk about in a moment, their businesses completely changed, and the public became so wildly unpredictable in their buying habits. They still had to eat. They still probably wanted to enjoy our products, but their means by which they could do that completely changed. I will say that the regulatory relief that came out early in the pandemic was critical. Our industry would not have survived without the governor, the comptroller again, the governor thereafter, coming out with these executive orders which would allow for our businesses to operate in ways they had not previously operated, but in ways that made perfect market sense for that time. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Last thing I'll say is the market completely shifted.
Evan. I just wanted to hop in specifically on this point because there's really two ways that the craft beverage space in terms of alcohol sales works for revenue stream. You have what Kevin was just referring to, which is the tap room experience. Come straight to the source, enjoy the beverages that we created here. But the second revenue stream is wholesale, where, we're making beer and a lot of our wholesale clients are restaurants and bars. And so that entire revenue stream completely went away because of the pandemic, because the restaurants and bars were shut down. So now we had all this beer and we couldn't sell it in our tap rooms because we're shut down there. We couldn't sell it to our wholesale customers because we're shut down there. And so everything pivoted to packaging. And, Comptroller, you mentioned in the beginning about, supply chain issues. We've been feeling those supply chain issues since March of 2020, specifically about sourcing packaging materials. How do you get your hands on cans? Because all of a sudden, where most of the beer was being put in these stainless steel kegs that were usable, better for the environment, that you could cycle through over and over again, you're using these single-use aluminum or glass packaging, and everyone's using them. And so it was impossible to get your hands on those goods. And it's still to this day, it's a little better now, but the pricing for it is twice as expensive as it was in early 2020. So we're paying double now what we were then. And it's still difficult to get our hands on, just a little less so than it was back in 2020.
I'm sure we'll talk more about the supply chain because it's not necessarily getting better. It's getting more expensive. It's still slow. But let me talk just briefly about some of the incredible things that we had that happened to us because of the good graces of the comptroller and the governor early on. And I just wanted to point this out because we would not have survived had a couple of things happened. First, the comptroller was the first one out to waive the caps that have been in statute for years, but to waive enforcement of the caps for breweries to sell to go and distilleries to sell to go. Because we all know what we did when we were first hearing about the pandemic. We went to the grocery store or the big box store, and we didn't just buy one roll of toilet paper, right? We stocked up. We bought, 4 jars of pickles and other things that we might need during the pandemic because we didn't know when we were going to be allowed to go out again because as you recall, what was happening, things were being shut down, things were being lifted, shut down. And so the waiving of those limits was incredibly helpful. And that was an easy thing that someone could do. And we happened to have a comptroller that saw that and understood that businesses shouldn't necessarily at this time be limited into what or how they were selling. The governor early on included the industry as essential, which you might not think that it would be, but they are manufacturing. They are hospitality. These were deemed early on to be essential. And that was critical because you began to see relief being tied to businesses that were essential. So those kind of determinations were very important early on. The governor then authorized through emergency executive order for the industry to be able to deliver their products to customers, still 21, and still checking ID, and also to ship via direct-to-consumer via common carrier, so UPS or FedEx, which made a lot of sense for wineries and for distilleries that had a more expensive product, sometimes a collectible product that customers were interested in. These changes, these authorizations, without these, the industry would not have survived the early days, unequivocally would not have survived. Grants and loans, and I will ask Julie to speak a little on this as well, just from her business standpoint. The emergency relief that came in the form of grants and loans, which didn't come fast. It was June, July, August, September when the money started rolling in after the businesses had been closed for 2 months or 3 months and had to completely rethink how they operated. That money came at the right time. Obviously, the federal money, the PPP loans, and the emergency injury Economic Industry Disaster Loans, EIDL, which we've forgotten what it means, but we just know the EIDL helped so many businesses survive. The Restaurant Revitalization Fund was another one that we're still hoping to get refunded because it did not nearly touch the businesses that it intended to. And I'd love to hear Julie speak about some of these because she has a unique perspective. One thing I'll say about the state grants were also helpful. They came in a couple of different tranches. There were grants that came through the Department of Commerce. There were grants that flowed down into the counties that could be applied for. And while they were helpful, it sometimes went, we hear this from members, months before they heard back about their grant. And sometimes when they heard about their grant, it had already been, the funds had been exhausted, a month or two prior, and they were finally just getting letters. But I will say that many counties, through state money and through federal money, were able to put out targeted, very interesting grants that helped certain members of the industry. But from a business standpoint?
So first, I just want to say, obviously hindsight is 2020. I think everyone was doing the best they could with what they knew and what they had in front of them, March of 2020 all the way up till today. That being said, I do think there are a few things that could have been a little different. One is I think that most of the grant programs, loan programs were trying to fix a 3-month problem, which was actually a 3-year problem, and coming up with solutions that would have been a very quick stopgap right there. So for example, and I'm just speaking specifically on the state and local level here, I think we applied for about 15 different grant and loan programs, mostly grant programs, and we got some of them, not all of them, but the grants were for $5,000 here, $5,000 there. I mean, our monthly rent in one of our locations is $25,000 a month. So it's helpful. I don't want to say no thank you to $5,000 in grant funds, but the amount of time and effort it took to apply for each one of those grants for the $5,000 in return, it would have been a much better program if it was just one grant, $100,000, apply for it once, and then you do reporting afterwards. So that's just one example. Specifically on the federal level, I want to mention Kevin referenced the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. That was a program that Congress put together. It came out in March of 2021 during the American Rescue Plan. It was wildly underfunded at the tune of about $60 billion. Congress knew going in that it needed to have more funds. I know, Senator Cardin in the great state of Maryland and Senator Van Hollen fought really, really hard to get more funds for this, and I thank them for that. Unfortunately, it just failed in the Senate recently, but the consequences of that is that 2 out of every 3 restaurant, bar, hospitality business, brewery, winery, distillery that applied and qualified for the funds received $0. So a lot of the businesses around the country and in Maryland were left out in the cold because that program just didn't have enough funds. I do think that the PPP program worked well. I do think, yes.
What did Denizens get?
For it just in,
Ballpark. Yeah.
from
these
all of
grants.
them, from all
Yeah.
the PPP program, we got a couple of those. We got the first round and the second round. All of it was 100% forgiven because we spent 100% of the funds on staff, on labor costs. We got about 700 to 800,000, I think, grand total. We also have a large staff. So the reason we were able to apply for that many funds is because we pay a lot of people a lot of money. And that's how you were able to calculate how much you qualified for. We did not get any restaurant revitalization fund. I don't believe got any actual state funds. Someone should look that up. I don't actually know. Again, like Kevin was saying, the beginning of this pandemic, it was just straight terror constantly. And I honestly have memory loss from a lot of those months. I just know that it was, and that's just from the stress and anxiety. It was just go, 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 go. But I will say, I do also want to reiterate, having the ability to do home delivery of our packaged products to people absolutely saved us. We would have run out of money. We would have completely gone under. And because of that, we were able to survive. We're not quite 100% where we were prior to the pandemic, which is a little frustrating because prior to the pandemic, right before, we were in this growth trajectory where we had hit the gas pedal, we had built the team, we were ready to go. We had just expanded to a second location. signed with the distributor. We were going to start selling a lot more beer, and then everything shut down. So we're, probably more like we're at like a flat space right now, but we're getting closer to where we were. I think I'm just gonna, since I have the microphone, when you're thinking about, again, from a small business perspective, your biggest things that you pay for every month are rent or mortgage, depending on whether you're owner occupied, payroll, and then debt service. Those are your three things. And a lot of the programs that were available in terms of grants or loans on the federal, state, and local, it's not just, I'm not just picking on Maryland, restricted how business owners could spend the money. And a lot of them wouldn't allow you to spend it towards debt service. And as a result of that, a lot of us are coming out of the pandemic in more debt than we had prior to the pandemic. And on top of that, layered with it, costs of goods sold have gone up. It feels a lot like chaos a lot of days. I will say that, consumers are going back. Revenue is definitely up. It's way better than it was in, March of 2020. But I do think that we have a long way to go for full recovery. And so there's just a lot to do. And I understand also, when you're putting out taxpayer dollars, it is your responsibility, and I know this is someone who has served in government before, you have to balance against fraud and speed, right? So speed, because this is an emergency, get the money out the door, but you also have to make sure you're protecting the tax dollars. That's your responsibility. And I think the state, the federal, and the local did actually balance that correctly in the beginning. And I think, as we get in less of an emergency state, there needs to be a little bit more pressure on preventing fraud and less speed. But it's, that's a tough balance to strike when you're also getting phone calls and emails from panicked business owners all over the state every day. So I think you guys did a good job. And again, hindsight's 2020. We can always learn lessons from how things went.
How's your mental health?
How's my mental health?
Everything back to normal or not?
No, I mean, listen, that's a totally fair question. I mean, this has been, I really do think that terror is the right word to describe it. I mean, I definitely had days in 2020 where I woke up and was just like in total panic. Like, how am I going to do this? I can't breathe. Like, this is, But then I had days where, I would get 100 orders for home delivery from the amazing community. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'll be able to pay my bills. And you feel this sense of hope. I do think that there's a lot of small business owners out there that feel a little like left in the cold, I guess is the way I would describe it, where it's like we're sort of, oh, you guys are doing fine now. We're out of the pandemic. Don't worry about it. You're good. You're good. Where it's like, you sign a lease, you have a finite amount of time to build your business, hopefully have some profitable years, and then either, sign another lease or retire. And there's 3 years that were taken from people who took these risks, and like, you couldn't necessarily renegotiate your mortgage. You couldn't necessarily renegotiate your rent. You had all these bills you had to pay, but your revenues were totally decimated. And so how do you dig out of that, right? And I just don't know. I think it's going to take a few years to get there.
How many employees do you have?
Currently, we have about, for full-time equivalent, about 35.
Excellent.
We had a little over 40 before the pandemic.
Thank you. Give my best to your surviving employees.
I definitely will.
It's a tough environment.
No, thank you.
Kevin, can we give some questions, or do you have more to present?
Absolutely.
So what is the employment in the sector as far as distilleries, wineries, and breweries?
So all told, we've got a little over, from a FTE standpoint, about 2,500, and that covers those who are working directly at the members themselves, the industry members, but also who are solicitors and sales reps and all of that. One thing that we've seen during the pandemic is a pulling back necessarily from the wholesale market, and the industry, as Julie said, has been packaging. If you didn't can your beer or package your spirits and wine in a way that consumers wanted before the pandemic, you had about 2 months to pivot and buy the equipment and get the supplies to do it. Otherwise, customers moved on. And so we've seen a lot of the industry take on new sales reps because they themselves are now promoting their products out in the industry. So that's a highlight in terms of new jobs. Events are happening again, lots of big community festivals, and there are teams at each of these member businesses that do that every weekend.
And what was the most significant barrier? Sounds like Julie and Denizens was able to navigate the system, but what was the barrier that kept, was it the application or the timing or what was it that everybody says, gee, I wish I'd known that?
I'd say that the biggest barrier during the pandemic to our members was finding single sources of information. There were grants announced all the time in press releases and news comments, and we'd see it on the news, but we couldn't find a single central website. That's something that we ended up spending a lot of time doing, was compiling every county's grants, every state application into a single web page for our members. And I know that Marshall did the same for his. There were news blasts coming out almost daily from the different organizations saying, oh, wait, there's more, check here. And as we kept getting interpretations and we kept getting clarifications about the grants, what you actually would qualify for versus not. And again, it's not to blame anyone, because it was just such chaos, and the state was trying to do the right thing. The counties were trying to do this. Fed was trying to do the right thing. But very often, in the rush to get it up there ended up being segments of the industry that were blocked out. Could be better targeted as well.
Well, in the future, maybe you only have 200 members, I think. I'm not sure what your membership is, but if you look at the breweries and distilleries and wineries, maybe the state should just, in the future, if this ever occurs again, simply not demand grant applications, not send money down to the locals to distribute to you, but simply say, look, what do you need? And we'll write a check.
Simplifying would certainly help for sure. But again, you have to balance that fraud versus, but you do already have a lot of information on us. We pay taxes every month, every quarter. I also think that in terms of the recovery programs, PPP is an example of this. This is federal, obviously not state, but if you were a business, you could apply for this thing. Like, there were industries that probably didn't need to apply for PPP, but they got the money. Target it. You could use NAICS codes. You can figure out, okay, these industry sectors are the ones that were shut down by government mandate. So these are the industry sectors that have access to these funds. That way, by the time people actually get to, oh, I didn't know I could apply for this, the money may not have run out by that point.
Yeah, no, that you guys put your finger on the major problem, because we had all sorts of good intentions and we had all sorts of money, but it ended up in many instances going to some, well, shall we say, very well-funded law firms and other entities that may or may not have or should have qualified, I guess is the right way to put it. Yeah. No, I really appreciate both of you for your presentation. And let me ask the Deputy Comptroller, Mr. Schaffel, if he has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. I do have a question. I just want to highlight two quick takeaways I have that I think are very important. One is, Julie, you made a point of, you applied for many, many different $5,000 dollar grants, right? And $5,000 is a lot of money, but not when you're writing bigger checks. And, watching the process unfold, the state often does this, right? We try to hit as many people as we can, but maybe in doing that, we dilute the power of what we're doing, right? And somewhere in there is a happy medium. I think what the comptroller was getting to, trying to make that direct connection. And in some of these other meetings we've had, the industries that are regulated like yours, we have that relationship. We know you, like we can connect with you very quickly. So I think that would be an interesting point, would be maybe the legislature should have worked with us a bit with some of those funds so we could directly funnel to you in a more efficient manner versus it all going through commerce, because that made sense to them at that point in time. Hindsight, right? And then I guess my question is, have your consumers forever changed, right? Is it a whole new ball game now? And how is that like, are you having trouble now getting capital to rebalance to the future of your industry because your industry is now hobbled by the pandemic from a bank's point of view kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you right now, I'm not interested in applying for any more capital ever again. I am way more risk averse than I ever was before the pandemic. And so the best capital I can get my hands on is customers paying me money for my products. And so trying to increase sales is a thing that I'm 100% eagle eye focused on right now. But I do believe that consumer behavior is forever changed. I think that there is a contingent of people who have stayed home for the last few years and are not going to come back out. And I don't think it's everybody. I think it's a small percentage, but there are folks who maybe before the pandemic would go out to eat in their local, Main Street restaurant once a month that just don't do that anymore. And those numbers add up, and they add up across the sector. I do think there's a permanent change in consumer behavior. And I also think the home delivery thing, while most people are not participating in that anymore in this immediate moment, there is a large group of people that are, and they expect to be able to do that going forward. So I'm interested to see, how the legislature here handles that going forward and the next governor.
Mr. Riley, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Controller. So obviously, takeaway. A common source of information as far as where you find out about programs and grants and whatnot. And I guess, Kevin, for you first, did your members, because it's a diverse group over a large area, did you seem like certain areas got more funding, or was it easier geographically? Because that's certainly something that we have heard. So what's your takeaway?
Well, and thank you for the question. I can tell you that members receive different levels of support at the jurisdictional level, and it's for obvious reasons. There are some counties that are better funded, some counties that just on a per capita basis have more active agencies, and so there are while there may be the same agencies or similar agencies in every county, sometimes it's one person as the head of 2 or 3 agencies in some of the more rural counties. And so it was incredibly important that we were able to, when a small county put out a notice, that we were able to get that up. But sometimes it would be us just happened to be hearing about it because it wasn't on their website. A lot of these you couldn't Google your way to the answer. You had to hear about it. And so we had an incredible amount of information coming in from members on a daily basis, new interpretations coming in on a daily basis. The words say this, but the city's enforcing it this way. The grants supposedly are open, but the application isn't, accepting new registrants at the moment. All of that was just ongoing. And again, you chalk it up to it being just chaos early on, and the state doing and the counties doing what they felt was the best at that time. And I think hindsight, clearer information, clearer deadlines, quicker responses on applications. I mean, it was sometimes months before you'd hear anything back.
I guess, Julie, the last question that I have before I turn it over to Mr. Hildebrand. Has there ever been any follow-up with you as a business from any of the agencies for what could we have done better? Has there been any follow-up, or was there follow-up perhaps maybe at the time why you didn't get a grant, if you didn't get one?
No.
You got my vote. Yeah. So here's the problem. We are paralyzed in this country by this notion of fraud. And we see a lot of it. Mr. Hildebrand, who's going to ask a question, is probably the state's leading expert on it. But we're paralyzed by it. Yep. We're scared of our own shadows. Yep. We don't want to give the money unless there's a 25-page application filled out in detail. And it's, I think that's one of the major lessons of this experience. Get the money appropriate, in the pockets of the people who need it. Put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's the speed in terms of the balance there. Get the money out. You can always claw it back later.
And if on the margins there's some fraud, we'll sick Hildebrand on them.
The economy would have been
It's good.
completely destroyed had the money gone out the door slower than it had in
Thank you.
2020.
Mr. Hildebrand is head of our risk management section, and David, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Just wanted to ask, one of the things I noted in the presentation that you talked strongly about was the regulatory changes that allowed you, to do new things. From your perspective, which one was more impactful? Was it the regulatory change or, the $5,000 checks here and there? I mean, I really want to look at, because that's something we haven't touched on a lot, is those changes that allowed things to continue through the pandemic and allowed many places to stay in business. So I wanted to hear from your perspective.
I think in the very immediate, it was the regulatory changes, because that would allowed us to just pivot the business model. I don't use the word pivot ever again, but pivot the business model and immediately be able to just start bringing in revenue each day in that new way of selling our product. That was huge. And I am very grateful that the state allowed us to do that. Yep.
Thank you.
Well, I'll quickly add to that without those regulatory changes, the business all 280 of the businesses would have just been shuttered because, yes, packaged goods stores were open. But you remember the first month or two, they were closed for indoor. They had a guy out or gal out front, and you'd walk up and they'd say, "What can I get you?" And you would name any of 10,000 brands. And if that person didn't know whether they had it or not, they would give you an alternative, which was a major national marketed brand. And so for months, that sector, that segment of the industry shut down for our members. And so without the ability to deliver, without the ability to ship, without the ability to sell, without that arbitrary cap, which the legislature did enact for another year and a half, and now they've pushed it a bit further. Without that, the industry would have been shuttered. And it was happening again this, February and March when we had a spike and life was still pretty much indoors, a little different now, but life was still indoors. Delivery of products shot up again, right? So the ability to keep that, customers want that. I was just remarking that, and to your point about going out to eat, I still don't go out to eat a lot, but I order in. I'm supporting those local businesses more than I have before. But I still like that carry out margarita, and it's you got used to it because that's what the market pushed you to. And so I think there's always, and the comptroller has been very good at this. What is really the reality of the market, and how do we get to meeting it? Yeah. It all retained jobs. I mean, that was the critical piece.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Let's move to Mr. Weston, if we could.
Good afternoon. For those that don't know me, I am Marshall Weston, the President and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Maryland. It is my pleasure to be representing the Restaurant Association of Maryland's Board of Directors today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on their behalf. We are the largest trade association for restaurants and the food service industry in the state of Maryland. Our members are restaurants, bars and taverns, food trucks, grocery stores, caterers, private clubs, hotels, and other businesses that serve food. And sometimes we know how to work a PowerPoint, and sometimes we don't. Thank you. So before the COVID pandemic, there were over 11,500 restaurants and food service operations in the state of Maryland that employed over 200,000 people. Based on the data that this office published for fiscal year 2019, our industry was responsible for over $750 million in sales tax revenue to the state. We are clearly one of the largest private sector industries, and we're also the backbone of every neighborhood and every community. So the COVID pandemic has had a tremendous negative impact on restaurants and their employees. By our estimates, anywhere from 1,700 to 2,000 restaurants and food service businesses closed permanently since March of 2020. And we are an industry of opportunity, and too many industries and too many opportunities were lost. So you may ask, what makes restaurants the industry of opportunity? Let me throw out a couple stats at you to kind of just make the point. Restaurants have long been the first job and offering second chances to countless individuals. You can start in the restaurant industry at an entry-level position and work your way up to management, ownership, or move on to another career. Restaurants employ more women and minority managers than any other industry. 40% of restaurant businesses are owned by minorities compared to 29% of businesses across the rest of the economy. 8 in 10 owners say that their first job in the restaurant industry was at entry level. The number of restaurant jobs paying between $45,000 and $75,000 a year grew 84% from 2010 to 2018. That's more than 3 times faster than the middle-class jobs in the overall economy. And when it comes to business ownership, 90% of restaurants are small businesses that have 50 or fewer employees. And these statistics are the reason why I appreciate the opportunity to provide feedback on Maryland's response to the pandemic, because our society and our economy lose when restaurants are not able to be successful. So it's been well documented and reported in the media the struggles restaurants and their employees have endured because of COVID. Government mandated restrictions on restaurants operations led to sales dropping 90% in some cases and closures altogether. Even restaurants that were able to continue operations, their sales were cut to up to 50%. We estimated that during the start of the pandemic, nearly 150,000 of those restaurant employees were laid off or had their hours significantly reduced. So it cannot be understated the amount of debt that restaurants took on in order to keep their businesses open. We just heard that a few minutes ago. And as already mentioned, many could not overcome these circumstances and ended up closing permanently. But even after we got beyond the lifting of the government restrictions that we were slow to recover due to decreased consumer confidence. Just when restaurants were poised to start down a road of recovery, if you will, Delta and Omicron were put restaurants in reverse. Holiday parties in just December of 2021, and this is nearly 2 years after the first COVID cases, they were canceled in large numbers because of variant scares. And the overall point that I'd like to make is being that the negative impacts of the pandemic continue to be felt today in the restaurant industry. There were, however, significant steps taken by federal, state, and local governments to assist restaurants in the hope of preventing permanent business closures. And with the livelihood of so many people at stake, relief efforts played a large role in keeping restaurants open. So as documented by the Department of Commerce at this work group back in June of 2021, the state of Maryland allocated $80 million in grant funds specifically for restaurants. Thank you. This was followed by an additional $22 million in Relief Act funds, again, specifically earmarked for restaurants. Thank you again. The Layoff Aversion Fund was also used by some restaurants, but specifically an organization like mine, an association, was able to take advantage of this program to keep my association employees working, especially at a time when restaurants needed our help the most, when they were in crisis management mode. And we heard about that already today. Our office went above and beyond trying to keep out the most relevant and most important information out to the industry. The state allowing for alcohol to-go sales provided a boost to restaurants while they were also desperately looking to try to make ends meet. This allowed for increased sales and helped to keep restaurant employees working and businesses open. The Comptroller's office also authorized several cessation of collection efforts and tax payment extensions that proved to be extremely helpful as well when it came to cash flow. When restaurants were struggling with these cash flow needs, these programs provided relief. There were sales and use tax extensions, withholding payment extensions, extension of the admissions and amusement tax, alcohol sales tax extensions, and even a sales tax credit of up to $3,000. It's also important to remember that many small businesses are pass-through entities, which mean that they pay their business taxes with their personal. So it has been very helpful for these businesses and restaurant employees as well that have their state tax deadlines extended until July if they so needed. Admittedly, this pandemic was something that no business could prepare for. Savings and reserves were drained quickly. Restaurants had to wonder how long they could hang on and remain open. And with that in mind, being better prepared for the next crisis is always a prudent discussion to have. So therefore, we are going to offer some areas of improvement to consider, although that we really hope that these considerations are never needed again. And we did hear many of the things a little bit earlier today, and I'm just going to kind of expand on them just a little bit. When it came to the state funds distributed to the local level that was supposed to get to the restaurants and businesses in need, we saw a significant uneven distribution of these state grant funds at the local level. Some jurisdictions had checks in restaurant owners' hands within days. Others had a cumbersome bureaucratic process that delayed grant payments with lack of communication. And as we learned, many small businesses were even discouraged from applying because they did not have the wherewithal to go through such a bureaucratic paperwork system. We understand that this was a large task, and yet most local jurisdictions were able to streamline their processes to provide grant funds relatively quickly. However, we are concerned about those jurisdictions that did not do so, and we hope that some lessons are learned and we look at best practices and just hopefully avoid these kind of delays in the future. Minority and ethnic restaurants. Yes, sir.
If I could just interrupt, if we swore that we would never release it, could you please just give us a little direction as to who had best practices and who might need a little bit of improvement and flexibility down the road? Well,
admittedly,
you don't have to do it publicly. Just
well,
put it on a piece of
admittedly,
paper
I
and
would
send it
like
us.
to, I thought about this question because it is a question that I would ask. And I think it would be a very good exercise for this office or the Department of Commerce or some entity to ask for a report from each local jurisdiction, being able to demonstrate where and how much money in a timeline went. So for me, that keeps me in the clear, but then we also have government oversight as well.
Excellent, thank you.
And I think when we look at that report, we will find, and I've not done a study on this personally, the Restaurant Association just knows of this anecdotally through speaking to restaurants in many jurisdictions across the state. We have learned that minority and ethnic restaurants were generally underserved in regards to the grant funds being administered by the counties. Language barriers, a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, and a lack of trust in government programs all played a part in too few minority-owned businesses applying for and receiving grant funds. This is clearly something that just needs to be on our minds, and we understand there's a need for speed, and there was a crisis management mode that we were all in. But far too many very small businesses with 15 or fewer employees, family-run businesses that were owned by minorities and ethnic restaurants did not play a significant part in receiving these grant funds. The lack of childcare options played a significant role in our ability to bring enough people back to work once we were finally having restrictions lifted. It still plays a role today. Our industry is one that prides itself on providing great flexibility to our employees in terms of work hours. But during the pandemic, when that flexibility was taken away from us and we had too few hours and we were basically told when and how we could operate, we were not able to bring in people back to work in our restaurants because of the lack of childcare that maybe did not align with the needs of the restaurants and other food service businesses. I think we need to, as a whole, make sure that we understand that all businesses need childcare in order to have their employees be productive, and restaurants and the food service industry are no different. And then, although the freezing of the unemployment experience rating for businesses was welcome, Rates obviously still did increase because of the movement in the table. This caught many businesses off guard. I'm not telling anybody anything new. I don't have a solution for you, but other than just bringing it up as a point that many businesses were caught off guard by this because of a lack of understanding of how the unemployment system rates and the tables work. So in closing, the financial and regulatory assistance provided by the state and local jurisdictions played a significant role in keeping many restaurants open. At one point in time, there were projections that up to 40% of all restaurants could close permanently. I am very thankful that that did not happen. Luckily, that number is closer to 15%. Still impactful, but not as damaging as we once thought. Restaurants provide an essential service and are the backbone of every community. We are dedicated to our employees by offering first jobs and careers with advancement opportunities. We're dedicated to our customers by providing exceptional dining options and service, and dedicated to our community by the support that we give to local charities, sports teams, events, churches. No community is complete without the restaurants that bring it all together. So we thank the state of Maryland, we thank the governor, the Comptroller's office, the Department of Commerce, and all of state government that helped us get through this crisis. And I hope that I never get to come up here and speak to you again about an issue such as this. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'll be
Yes,
happy to take any
thank you,
questions.
Mr. Weston. And do you have any suggestions about what the state could do to facilitate the return of people to, even if it's anecdotal, that would help bring people back? I know there's some hesitancy, but.
There still continues to be that hesitancy. And I'm not sure that there is any one thing that can be specifically done other than time. I think people will become more comfortable over time. But I will say this, restaurants have had to adapt to the idea of takeout and carryout. It was spoken about earlier. Restaurants that historically did not offer takeout or carryout options were forced to do so. And they had to do it well because they want their brand to be represented, whether you are sitting in your at a table in the restaurant or at your dining room table at home. That is your brand. That is your livelihood. So restaurants had to figure that out. So I think the overall message that the state should be supporting is the idea that restaurants are part of our communities, campaigns to support people supporting these small businesses. As I mentioned, 90% of all restaurants are small businesses with 50 or fewer employees. Tourism plays a significant role in the health of restaurants. As we encourage people from out of state to come here to the state of Maryland, restaurants will benefit. As we encourage Maryland citizens to go across this great state and to visit places they may have never seen before, a restaurant generally will benefit from that. So I think an overall campaign of just reinforcing how important restaurants are to every neighborhood and community and encouraging people to support them would go a long way.
Here's an idea. How about a 1-week sales tax holiday for restaurants?
I support, you have my vote on that one.
Yeah,
I support that fully.
Little shiny objects. So,
I know that in other tax holiday situations, people are incentivized to go out. And restaurants would benefit greatly from that incentive to have people to come out, try something new, or just old. But that is something my members would really welcome.
Quick questions from anyone?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the presentation. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say 1,700 to 2,000 closed, or was it 17,000 to,
1,700 to 2,000, roughly 18% of the total restaurants. I would love for the Comptroller's office to verify that number. We have a difficult time as restaurants are constantly in flux, but that is our best estimate.
Are you seeing new restaurants opening now as things are starting to open back up, or are those just lost kind of forever?
Here's
because of
what
the changes?
we are seeing now, and this obviously could change because restaurants are the dream of many people. Restaurants are a low barrier for those that want to own their own business. Restaurants are as we know here in Maryland, a place where people who immigrate to this country and live here in Maryland, it's a great opportunity for them to build a middle-class lifestyle. But right now, we're not seeing that because of lots of different reasons: financial barriers, uncertainty in the market. But what we are seeing is those restaurants that have closed or who are deciding to close. Many are being purchased by current restaurant owners, sometimes larger restaurant groups. So we aren't necessarily losing restaurants in mass. We are losing more small businesses, as one entity may take on another location and sometimes 3 or 4. That's what we're seeing more today because they have the financial wherewithal to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can move on to our final presentation. Mr. Brainard, thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Weston. That was terrific. Very, very good presentation.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jeff Brainard. I'm the Vice President of Hospitality and Sales with Southern Management Companies. Southern Management, as you know, was founded in 1965, and just in Maryland has 68 apartment communities, 23,000 apartment homes, as well as 3 hotels, and that is my responsibility. And what I wanted to talk today is kind of representing hotels, not part of the Maryland Hotel Lodging Association as a representative. I am on the board with the Maryland Tourism Coalition, but just talk about our experience as hoteliers and in interacting with hotels over the past several years. I joined Southern Management in 2019, which was perfect timing, things going, and then 2020 welcomed me into a disaster management. But as we talk about really the impact on hotels. And everybody will talk about the restrictions and impact. Hotels were obviously very heavily impacted throughout the pandemic, but kind of got it on both ends, because as what hotels really experienced were restrictions that were implemented for, say, restaurants and gatherings, as well as we were deemed essential, which was great in a lot of ways. We were allowed to stay open. However, being able to stay open increases your costs. And then when travel was basically shut down, almost at one point, literally criminal, if you didn't have your papers going into work to travel, or you were saying you were out of state, then you shouldn't have been on the road. So we had hotels that closed. We had hotels that reopened. But then when there was reopening, there were different scales of restrictions, as some of the other speakers, talked about. And as we looked at those restrictions, a big piece of hotel business, especially full service hotels, is meetings and events. Those impact restaurants, those impact communities, but they are a large part of the workforce for hotels. Well, when hotels reopened, there were really no meetings and events, and a large part of that workforce went away. And the challenge for just even with PPP and other things, there was really no ability to retain all of those team members because there were no banquets, and we knew that part of it wasn't going to be a 3-month wasn't going to be a 3-month issue. And that impacted, hours of operation, outlet availability, and even to this day, a lot of those things continue to be restricted just because of the availability of workforce. And then obviously the cost of workforce changed pretty significantly, over the past couple of years. And as we talk about, overall travel and the state economic impact, through March 22, travel spending in Maryland's down 16%, but that's really $12.9 billion. That represents $1.2 billion in federal tax, $500 million in state tax, and almost $300 million in local tax, just from travel spending. The kind of hidden impact for a lot of hotels that are, large or have tenant spaces, leased restaurants, offices, others, just like other buildings in commercial sector, there were rent abatements. There were periods with no rent. There were additional costs, CAM costs and charges that were assumed. So even during the shutdown and slowdown, costs increased to the hotel owner and or operator during that same time that things were restricted. Over the period, the state was helpful in that there were $60 million in total that were allocated, for, they were earmarked for hotels. There were other programs, but Maryland came up with 60 million. And I just want to, kind of compare that, because the data that I gave some U.S. travel industry and showing kind of the breakdown and where we were at that point, as again, a $12.9 billion impact runs across those sectors, but hotels are central to that in those outside tax dollars. And I believe the comptroller commented a couple of weeks ago just on that, and in talking about the gas tax holiday and having people come across the state, state lines, and that is going to drive tax revenue. Well, hotels are central to that. But the big part of hotels isn't just the heads and beds. A hotel, an event center, a conference center, bringing people in, convention centers, bringing people in to the community to spend money in restaurants, to spend money in retail, to explore areas, to see our, the vacation spots, to visit the wineries. That's critical. So when we looked at the 50 million that was allocated for hotels, it was broken down by state. And obviously the state has a responsibility, as others have said, to balance that responsibility of where do the dollars go and how are they allocated. And this is where the challenge really came in for hoteliers. We kept our properties open. We took care of the guests that we could. And as we recovered, we tried to regain, our team members and get those team members back. So we had limited resources. You had hotel general managers and leaders on the front lines, checking people in, checking people out, cleaning rooms, doing whatever we need to do to take care of our guests. But the decentralization of information and the understanding of where these dollars went, we know where they went, but that's where they were allocated to. We don't know how much was spent. We know how much we were able to get based on caps and different things. Similarly, Montgomery County just approved another measure which will give $500 per room. And similar to the $5,000 grants and things that we're talking about with the wineries and those, it isn't that we're not appreciative, but the scope of the loss, especially during those early periods and the limitations on some of those funds, especially PPP. To talk PPP just for a second, one of the challenges there is how hotels can be structured. Everybody thinks of Marriott and Hilton and big boxes, and they've got all these billions of dollars. But the reality is a hotel is a pretty complicated asset where you may have an owner, a separate management company or a group of owners, a franchise fee on top of a management fee, and all these different structures. So it isn't Marriott's money. It's whoever this investment group is. And they have that debt service. They have that retail space. They have that, tax bill and utility bills. So even closing a large hotel, just the roughly cost, if you shut it down and you have no staff, you still may incur, and we can speak to this specifically, $400,000 to $500,000 to $600,000 a month still in expenses to have that building in place. So ownership groups were coming out of their pockets literally for tens of millions of dollars on top of already high debt service to maintain their businesses as they worked through to try and qualify for PPP and federal and then some state aid. With no central repository for information, it was extremely difficult and time consuming to find those grants, and the difference between the municipalities and localities that were awarded funds on who would get them. So if you look at 60 million in total for hotels, out of the total pandemic spending, I think this task force identifies a total of 62 billion. That's 0.0976%. I did the math. So a little less than 1/10% was earmarked for hotels. Now, there were other things that were available, but we're still looking for those dollars and understanding all those monies that were allocated, what, if anything, is left and still available. As I talked about some of the other impacts, and that's really the biggest one is the third bullet point on here, the movement of displaced workers out of the industry, many with state assistance, because at that time, they're filing for unemployment, trying to get people hired, move those frontline team members out of our industry. Now, everybody has taken, pay increases 10 to 20%, but as you look nationally, there's 5 million people looking for 11 million jobs. Doesn't mean they're all necessarily qualified for those jobs, but still you have a gap of 6 million. Well, that's exacerbated in frontline service and housekeeping and banquets and even front office, because there is just a wealth of other opportunities out there. So that limits us recovering in that, do we have all our rooms available to even sell if they were available, or checking guests in or providing the service that we are known for and we want. And then there was the additional cost. because to reopen and to be open, a number of associations and state agencies and federal guidelines said we need to change our guidelines for safety and security, which is critical. But in a hotel, give you the hotel at the University of Maryland, for example, we have 297 keys, 45,000 square feet of space, 37 basically rooftop units or large HVAC units. So you're changing between 500 and 600 filters to a MERV 13 or better. That cost increase on an annual basis, just the increase, not the actual cost to change them. The increase is over $40,000 a year for that one asset, just to change the filters, to hit the levels that we needed to hit. We have UV at other hotels. We have all kinds of sensors and things, but that's on top of your sanitation and other things and redistributing staff to maintain a safe environment to welcome guests back. And again, you see the different acts that were done, and very appreciative of these dollars, but those costs continue. So as we look to see what might be left, there's no information available to us on what was actually spent or allocated, and allow us to take our resources, as a couple of people said earlier, trying to do the Google search or reaching out to offices is lots of time fruitless. And it's really been a challenge. And you hear anecdotally these things are there, but trying to find access is really, it's critical. And there's corporate operators, there's individual operators, there's levels of hotels from motor inns to lodges, and that staffing and the ability to pay those bills, whether your mortgage is $10,000 a month or $200,000 a month, those bills continue to go. And being able to find that money and get it quickly was a significant challenge for hotels, because where restaurants and other things were earmarked because they're on popping there every corner, hotels are still around, but they think of the big names, and that really hurt the independent operators and some of the smaller. If you look out at Ocean City or some of the other areas where staffing is really a challenge and restaurants are closed or hotels are limited to rooms, that continues to be a significant challenge for us, and how we can identify ways to help fund that going forward. I doubled that one up, and we'll go to access. The real challenge really is, as we saw it for hotels, and we experienced this with our properties, the access varied by municipality. Some were applications, some in one instance we actually got a call, said, "Hey, do you know this grant is available?" "No." "That's awesome." "Oh, wait, you don't qualify." But it was a start, because we're building those relationships. And there's a challenge with, again, hotels, especially your smaller properties, where your general manager may be at the desk or may be around, trying to find that information was extremely difficult. And a thing that really hasn't been talked about is when you did find the information, and okay, there's an application, every municipality had a different set of statistics or requirements available to try and qualify for those funds. So you were going back and with limited resources, especially if you were a smaller property, trying to determine, well, what was your full-time equivalent count? What was it then? And what were the dollars now? And you could have tax, but they were slice and dice of 4-month period or 4-month period. Montgomery County's program is now September to January, a comparison period September to January. That's a lot of work. It'll be great to help those properties. But taking off-cycle periods and doing that, a lot of properties won't have the wherewithal or just the time to be able to generate that with these limited applications. And if you weren't in there early, you missed out, because there weren't a ton of dollars allocated. One of the things that Comptroller, you mentioned earlier, what can be done. What I wanted to include in this presentation and part of the Q&A, I hope, is what can Maryland do? There is still a significant need for staffing, and probably more so than anything else is the bodies to do the job that we want to do. But I've listed a couple of things that we've talked about, not just within Southern, but in different work groups and different groups, and literally as we try and fund the restaurants and bars at night, trying to figure out how do we get better. And it really starts to me and a lot of us is, how do we make Maryland the best place for business travel, and to incentivize doing business in Maryland and coming and visiting Maryland to host business? Because you see states that with different levels of recovery, they were based on restriction. And when I mentioned restriction in meetings and events, I just want to give a quick example before I go into this. Restaurants were allowed to be at 75%. In some municipalities, that at one point you were at 50 to 75%. Same municipalities had limits on meetings and events. One property of a 15,000 square foot ballroom where I was allowed to have 75 people. Downstairs in my 2,700 square foot restaurant, I was allowed to have 206. So I have a 15,000 square foot ballroom where I could host meetings and events and bring people back and go, but I would have to put that meeting and event in the restaurant because that was the only space legally that we could host it. And those restrictions went far beyond the length of time. And then again, that hurt us with the staffing. That's kind of where we are now. So when I talk about incentivizing meeting and events, it really is to look at those restrictions and how that set it back on your booking timeline to say, hey, Maryland is open, we're ready to do business, and we want to make this the state where business wants to come and go to. One of the other areas, and I think Julie mentioned it, is the individual marketing for those programs, and as I'm talking about it for properties, incentivize and earmark funds from hotel taxes that properties can access for property-specific marketing campaigns. We all have occupancy taxes and state taxes as a way to just apply for marketing funds so I can do an online campaign, so I can do a targeted meetings and events campaign in key feeder cities and target those areas to bring their groups to our state and to our properties. Another large area would be support the citywide programs in Baltimore City. Baltimore City is in need of convention business. Provide complimentary rental to the convention center and for programs generating in excess of 5,000 room nights or shows with 10,000 plus visitors. And do state supported shows. The convention centers will still get their money. The city would still get their money, but the associations and the groups that are struggling with membership wouldn't have to pay those high rental fees with the promise of they're delivering business to the state, which helps hotels, meetings, conventions, restaurant, tax dollars, merchants of all types. And also grant dollars to help hotels offset the cost of temporary labor, which is 15 to 20% higher than standard labor on average. And that is, unfortunately, a large part of the workforce of hotels right now. I can tell you that for our 3 properties, we're working with 6 different temp labor agencies to try and staff our properties so that we can fully operate the properties and provide the services that we want to do. We want to have our team members. We have a great culture, we have a great company, and we're trying to attack the talent that we can and train and develop and hold. But we need that assistance because business has come back, and properties are forecasting to be, top line probably 70 to 90% of 2019 on top line revenue. So you hear the big percentages and recoveries, but being 70 to 90% of 2019 is not recovered because you're going to be 70% or less of your profitability because the costs have grown exponentially over those 3 years. The debt service has grown over those 3 years. Your labor costs have grown over those 3 years. So while we may be close to back from a top line, we're not there from a profitability line. So wanted to share some ideas and again, thank the state of Maryland for what has been done and for hosting this work group and giving us the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Presentation, Mr. Hildebrand.
Thank you very much, sir. I did have 2 questions for you. You mentioned the difficulty in finding the different grants and the pieces, and we've kind of heard that at each meeting. Was there, costs that you incurred? Did you have to end up basically hiring someone who knew these funds to go get them, or was it just you were spending a lot of time and effort that could have been spent elsewhere?
It was the latter. We didn't have the luxury to really hire people to do that. It was everybody looking in. What are you hearing? We're lucky with Southern where we have some additional resources in other areas where everybody's working with different pieces of government to leverage different relationships. But even with that, trying to identify, what those different funds were. One of the biggest problems, and I haven't heard it, mentioned, I looked at some of the presentation, is during the pandemic, nobody's coming in the office. So even if different people had information, there wasn't the normal information sharing because, hey, Bob's a couple of cubes over and I can ask Bob. Bob wasn't here. Bob was only available via Zoom when you had the meetings. So you had a lack of communication in the different government offices and departments than you would normally have. So you have basically a layer of disconnected bureaucracy. So you'd have your forums and stuff, but then this person was only in or certain days, or you didn't have your normal contacts. So that made the research that much tougher. So it was really grassroots trying to find it and call who you knew and see what was available.
Thank you. And then one other, you mentioned using the filters as an example of an increased cost that were then new regulations, new requirements. Do you have like a percentage of what that cost increase was? I mean, 40,000 is obviously a lot if you had hundreds of those filters, but to put it in a scale people could understand in your line of business, what, was it a 10%, a 15% increase?
25 to 30.
25 to 30?
25 to 30% increase in like cleaning and safety security, costs and things, just because when you're going from, a MERV 11 or a MERV 11, that's the filter type, that's going to be at least 20%. Some more depending on the size, and they're unique because they're expensive.
Thank you very much.
So that's a big one.
Okay, Mr. Brainard, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Give my regards to the company, and we will probably have some follow-up questions to get back to you with.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The hearing of the work group. Thank you very much, everybody. And we have one meeting next month? We haven't gotten the date, but we will communicate that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.